So let me at this time introduce our panelists. I will start with you, Anders Meibom. You are Director of the Transnational Red Sea Center at the EPFL, as we've just heard. Next to you is Fanny Douvere, Head of the World Heritage Center's Marine Program for the UNESCO, and Tamaki Bieri, Chief Operating Officer of Coral Gardeners. And joining us virtually is Emma Camp, Team Leader for the Future Reefs Program at the University of Technology in Sydney, and Kristen Marhaver, Coral Reef Biologist from the Caribbean Research and Management Biodiversity Foundation in Curaçao. So let me start with you, Anders. The Transnational Red Sea Center works in a complicated area. You just need to look at a map to understand that. So how do you leverage scientific diplomacy to promote collaborations between countries in such a sensitive area?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. I would like to thank GESDA actually for organizing this event, and thank you to State Secretary Fasel for your kind words. I don't really know how to respond to that actually, but maybe I'll start by drawing up the contours a little clearer, because I know this is a very diverse audience, and I think you mentioned some of the things that are at stake here, but I want to make it clear what we're talking about when we talk about coral reefs and the crisis that's unfolding in our oceans today in general. Because you are absolutely right, in the last 30, 40 years we lost 50% of what we call the pre-industrial coral reef cover across the world today. And what is worse actually is that at the rate, which is greatly increasing, at the rate at which we are losing coral reefs at the moment is anticipated, and I'd like to point out the A in GESDA there is for anticipation. It's anticipated that we will only have something like 10-15% of the corals left mid-century, which is 25 years from now. It's like this. In fact, 25 years is also within the anticipation horizon of GESDA. So the situation is really quite serious, and it's not just a question of losing pretty fish, and you know, it is a question of losing an enormous amount of biodiversity, and actually a big fraction of a sheer volume of the bulk of the life in our oceans, because the corals are habitat and they're breeding grounds for a very large fraction of this life. And so, and then of course losing the many ecosystem services that healthy reefs bring, in particular seafood. There was a very nice session this morning about food security on land, but there's we could have the same debate about food security from the ocean. There are hundreds of millions of people depending on this source of seafood, for example. Then there's the tourism, there's the coastal protection, etc. So the situation is really, we should not sugarcoat it, it's really serious. And of course, in that situation, when we discovered, the discovery was made some years ago now that the corals, so what's killing the corals? It was invoked, there's local pollution, local stress, environmental factors locally. But these are things that in principle, we should be able to minimize and mitigate. Unfortunately, there's this global factor. There's global warming, which is actually perhaps the most efficient killer of corals, because global warming keeps pushing the temperatures up. More and more frequent heat waves appear, and they push the temperature above this certain threshold that the corals, above which the corals basically get stressed, and eventually they bleach and they die. And so there is this situation, and in that context, of course, when we discovered, it was discovered some years ago now, and we were among the team that quantified this, that the corals in the northern part of the Red Sea, in particular, the Gulf of Aqaba, are extremely resistant. They can take much more heat than any other coral population, at least that I know of. It was a big deal, because it really provided a hope that at least this major and quite frankly very biodiverse reef could survive beyond the end of this century, almost no matter what heating trajectory we are on. I mean, by now, 2 degrees by the end of the century is almost guaranteed. It probably could be 3 easily, which would be a very big problem for most coral populations that we know of, but in that part of the world, the Red Sea, actually they might survive. So that was a big deal. Now the question is, what do you do with this? Okay. And the problem, there's a peculiarity in the Red Sea, which is that it's a very small body of water. And from a hydrological perspective, the Gulf of Aqaba, for example, is a bathtub. So any local source of pollution spreads immediately and immediately becomes a regional scale problem. And so in order to protect these corals, the logic is very simple. If we have to protect these Red Sea corals, it has to happen on a regional scale. And so what we need is the vision of the Transnational Red Sea Center was very simple. We need two components here. We need the best possible science and new technologies to underpin the best monitoring efforts, provide the data for the most efficient and the most intelligent, if you want, coral reef protection in the area. And on the other hand, we need diplomacy to create a dialogue and pave the way for this work among the governments. And so in this context, we have had the luck to be able to work with the foreign ministry here, have an incredible support that we have enjoyed, starting with Foreign Minister, Federal Councillor Cassis, State Secretary Alexandre Fasel. In his previous capacity was Switzerland's Science Diplomacy Ambassador and has been directly involved in this. We are enjoying a very, very close collaboration with a wonderful team in Bern on an almost maybe too regular basis for you, I don't know, it's probably, but under Ambassador Alexander Baumann. And then, as it was said, the ambassadors in the region who have really gone out of the way for helping us and are opening the doors at a very high governmental level. And so for us, to answer your question now,
Thank you. Finally.
Sorry. To us, science diplomacy is not a question of a fashion. It's not a question of a nice to have. It's a must. We have to do it this way. And I think through the work we have done and the collaborations we have established now, where we really have created a fabric of collaboration across the Red Sea region, we have shown that it actually works.
Okay. So Fanny, to stay on the science and diplomacy theme, what about the role of UNESCO's World Heritage Program? How does it contribute to coral reef protection, I should say, excuse me, and what role do you play in inciting international support?
So the UNESCO has multiple mandates when it comes to the protection of coral reefs and ocean conservation in general. So on the one hand, it has an ocean science mandate. The World Heritage Convention has a very specific mandate. I think everybody in the room knows the 1972 World Heritage Convention for protecting really exceptional and unique places like the Taj Mahal in India or other cultural and man-made structures, but it also protects about 15% of the world's coral reefs today. So we have 29 coral reef ecosystems across different countries around the world that are inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage List because they are considered of outstanding universal value, and they're considered as places that are so unique and important, and the coral ecosystems are so exceptional that the conservation shouldn't be left to just one country. It should actually be a protection that is done collaboratively, whether it comes to the science that is needed or the kind of activities, the extractive activities that are happening. It should be a collective action across multiple countries. So the 1972 World Heritage Convention has a very particular mandate to oversee the state of conservation of the coral reefs that are inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage List. And so it has a very direct and a very concrete impact. And I can give you some examples. Everybody is probably or has heard in the press about the tremendous impact of climate change on Australia's Great Barrier Reef. It is the world's largest coral reef ecosystem, still to this date the most diverse coral reef ecosystem. So UNESCO has been working hand in hand for the last 15 years with the government of Australia to try to at least make sure that that reef has some chance to survive within these very rapid changes that it's undergoing currently when it comes to climate change. So we are, as UNESCO and with the World Heritage Convention, not the right place to look at climate mitigation. Climate mitigation sits in other United Nations conventions, such as, of course, the UN FFC. But what we are doing is very concretely looking at what are the local activities that are destructive and are really destroying the resilience of a reef system. So when you look at the last 10 years, especially since we go to the site, we go on site when we have very serious and significant issues like in Australia's Great Barrier Reef. And a critical part of our work is to look and talk to all the different actors that are operating in that particular place. Now, this might sound very normal, that this should be happening in local government, national governments should undertake that. But when you look at coral reefs today and the way they're managed, shipping is done in the shipping department, tourism is done in the tourism department, fishing is done in the fisheries department. There's often international actors, companies that are going to a particular place and operating in that place. And all of these different activities together are really destroying the resilience of a reef system. So as UNESCO, a critical part of the work we do is we go to these places, we bring all these different partners together, and we help the government to prioritize what's now the most important actions to be taking, and what is the most important legislation to put in place or policies to put in place in order to make sure that all these multiple activities that are happening there, it's not going to entirely destroy the resilience of that reef. And so we have very concrete outcomes. We have them in other places around the world as well. But the Climate Act, for example, that was signed by the Australian government, effectively stopped almost a decade of climate wars when it was signed in 2022. And that's the kind of direct influence that a convention as a World Heritage Convention can have when it comes to conservation. The government also invested over $500 million to reverse water quality. And when you look at our reporting 10 years ago, nobody actually was very much talking about climate change and how it interacts, how the effects of climate change interact, for example, with the resilience of the reef that actually is impacted to a large extent through that water quality. So we're pushing governments and working together with governments to set some of these priorities and turn really that scientific information to turn that into decision making, because ultimately that's where the rubber meets the road. We can have all the science we want, but we have to turn it into decision making, and we have to work with countries and governments to really make sure that the right policies are put in place and some of the activities do stop. So we do that kind of work, not just in Australia. I can give you other examples as well, but that's basically the core of the mandate that UNESCO has, is to oversee the state of conservation of those sites on the UNESCO World Heritage List, but then also really work hand in hand together with the government, with the NGOs as well, and with the science community to bring that together and do the right thing in a particular area.
Thank you. I would like to move on to the field, if I can use that expression, or in the sea, and talk a little bit about innovative conservation techniques we are seeing today. So Emma, we've been talking about the Great Barrier Reef. Fanny has mentioned it several times. Tell us more about cutting-edge methods being used there to develop and to restore corals.
Yes, thank you. And I think, to contextualize this, I think there's two really important parts. The first is that there's an array of stresses that the reef is facing, like absolutely climate change and ocean warming is one of the biggest threats, but there are still other impacts. And so when we look at the restoration and the innovative approaches that are being taken, it's really a toolbox of approaches, and that can span from geoengineering, things like trying to actually brighten clouds to reduce the light stress that gets to corals on the reef that can actually make coral bleaching worse, through to community level restoration, such as growing and planting corals at key high value sites, and then a whole portfolio in between. So there's things such as assisted evolution, where there's efforts to try and speed up the natural evolution process by either taking corals from naturally warm environments. We've heard about the Red Sea and how special that is. We can also find on the latitude of the Great Barrier Reef areas where corals are warmer than others, and trying to crossbreed them to increase that tolerance. And also just looking within populations to try and find the corals that have got the highest thermal resilience and using those in restoration practices. I think a really key point is that if we look at the innovative restoration that's happening, particularly here in Australia, restoration really only began after the 2016 and 2017 back-to-back coral bleaching events that occurred here. So compared to other areas such as in the Caribbean where restoration has been occurring a lot longer, there really has been a loss of development in a short period of time, but equally we're in that restoration science. So a lot of these activities are at a research and development stage where we're having to learn very quickly which strategies have got the greatest chance of success so that we can implement them. We heard from Andreas at the beginning the threat that the reef's facing, and I think the link to society and to human rights. If we lose reefs, we have a right to a healthy, sustainable environment, and we have a real risk of losing that if we lose coral reefs. And so again, in this portfolio of interventions that are being considered, we also are having to consider the risks to society, the risk of inaction if we don't do anything. And so as a scientific community, there's not just the science, but there's also understanding the social license and the implications of the activities that are being considered. So there really is a portfolio of approaches, I would say, being undertaken at this time with varying levels of, progress at this point. But the ultimate goal of all of these restorations is to buy time for the reefs between stress events. And that's really, for me, the biggest concern is that we know if we give reefs some capacity, they can recover from stress events. But the frequency and severity of the events that reefs are facing is eroding that capacity for resilience on the reef. And so these tools that we're trying to implement are to buy time for reefs where ultimately we must tackle climate change, because if not, we're going to have a limited future for reefs.
Okay. Now, Kristen, your focus is more on baby corals and making sure they survive and grow into thriving coral ecosystems. Can you tell us a little bit more about your research, and it's in the Caribbean?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yeah,
GESDA,
we don't hear you. I think you're muted. Can you hear us?
Unmuted, but we are working through the Caribbean internet.
There, we hear you. Go ahead.
Thanks very much for this opportunity. Thank you for the introduction and for GESDA for organizing us. I've heard a few common themes already from the group, including the importance of transnational collaboration and the importance of tech transfer. So I'll touch on that in terms of the work that I do here in Curaçao. I also wanted to paint a little bit of a different version of reality to complement the statistics that we've heard about loss of coral reefs and their value. So as a coral reproduction scientist, my job is to learn how to grow baby corals. So imagine if there were no humans under 30 years old. There were no teenagers, no babies. Imagine the person you know who struggled the worst with infertility, and then imagine that was every single person on Earth. Now imagine the same was true for cows and pigs and dogs and cats and chickens. Imagine the only animals that had successfully reproduced in the last 30 years were a few pigeons and a few insects. That is what's happening on coral reefs. Even when we still have corals left, they're often too sick to make eggs, and when they do make eggs, the babies never survive. So these corals behind me, some of the most significant reef builders in the Caribbean, we haven't seen a juvenile in decades. So that's my job, is to try to figure out how to get the babies back. And one of the roles that we play here in Curaçao is figuring out how to grow baby corals, how to collect them, when do they spawn, how do we keep them alive in the lab, how do we feed them and keep them alive, and then transferring that technology all around the world. It not only applies to our Caribbean neighbors and our Atlantic neighbors who have the same species of corals in their oceans, but it also applies to other ocean regions, because often the techniques for keeping one species alive apply to others as well. So this really speaks to the importance of investing in science, technology transfer, collaborating across nations, and it also speaks to what State Secretary Fasel was saying about any nation being a great seafaring nation. So even if you are from a country that doesn't have a coastline, that doesn't have coral reefs, we've all exploited the tropics, right, for hundreds of years, and so we can all now heal the tropics by investing in science and restoration. Now, I do also want to touch quickly on the theme of local conservation, which has come up a couple of times already as well. We just saw in Curaçao most of the corals in town fail to spawn. They did not make any eggs this year. These are corals that are affected by fertilizer human sewage, sedimentation, dredging, the construction of hotels, all kinds of human threats. However, the corals that are from an undeveloped region of the island with very little human pressure, they still made eggs, they still spawned. So if you, as a politician, a diplomat, an ambassador, a conservationist, want to make a difference and be remembered in your country and do something big now, the most important thing is to take big stretches of land and not ever develop them. Protect them from development forever. It will make a huge difference in buying us time and creating the sort of seed banks in which we will look in the future for the coral parents that are going to make the future coral babies. So even if you are not able to invest massive amounts in science in other countries, even if you're not able to host a big research lab in your own country that's advancing science and technology, you can still take a piece of land and protect it from development forever.
Thank you. Now, we've heard about local engagements, and grassroots movements are also very important in the fight to save corals. Tamaki, tell us how a grassroots movement like yours, like Coral Gardeners, which implicates local communities, how does it contribute to this conservation movement?
Yes, thank you for that question. And maybe a little bit of context about Coral Gardeners, because it's probably not as famous as the Transnational Red Sea Center or UNESCO. We are a coral restoration organization based out of Moorea, French Polynesia. And the organization was founded 7 years ago by Tito and Bernico, who was born and raised in French Polynesia. And meanwhile, we have grown to almost 70 people and operate also in Fiji and Thailand. And our theme is really locally led coral reef restoration. And the main challenge, while I think everybody agrees that that's the model that should be replicated around the world, really the main challenge for these communities is to have the funding available to do restoration and to carry out science-based restoration. So what we do is try to revolutionize ocean conservation and create a global movement. And for that, we use some unconventional approaches, I would say. So we have a huge social media presence. We feel that we do not need to preach to the choir, so the scientists and all of you that already know that coral reefs are in peril. But we try to reach audiences, and especially the younger crowd, the next generation that we think should be stewarding coral reefs through social media. We do a lot of branding. We try to make coral reef restoration sexy so that people want to get engaged. And we also do ecotourism, for example, so that we are not reliant just on philanthropy and public funds. And another big pillar is that we have an in-house science and technology team. So Emma and Kristen probably noticed there's obviously a lot of cutting-edge science being done at universities, but often it is hard to bring the tools into the hands of local community members. And there can also be a disconnect between what's being done at these well-funded research institutions and what really the local communities would need. And so we create simple tools, basically take what the science and technology world already knows that works, has been tested in several locations, and we make simple tools that anybody with a little bit of training can use. So this is something like a reef monitoring app. A simple app on an iPhone where instead of having to write down how many corals you took and where you put them on a underwater slate and then put them into an Excel sheet and try to analyze, our gardeners have an app on an iPhone with an underwater case, and they can just enter the data there. The analysis is done automatically. They don't have to have a PhD in reef biology to understand what's going on, and that will inform what species we should be growing, how many, ensure that we have genetic diversity, and then also monitor the outcome of our restoration efforts so that we know that what we are doing is working, or if it's not working, we can make changes and hopefully get a better outcome in the future.
Okay, you've mentioned the financing challenges of small grassroots movements like yours. Isn't that a problem, though, for conservation of corals? It seems like everybody is working in their own little space all over the world. Wherever there are corals, everybody is doing something to try and conserve them. Is that a big problem, to not try and sort of gather all these initiatives under one roof?
Yes, I think that's one challenge. There is certainly competition for funding, and if it was better coordinated among the groups, we could probably do better. I also feel like a lot of the funding sources are geared towards scientific institutions. So, there's these big funding pots available now, whether it is the Global Fund for Coral Reefs or CORDAP, but the applications require somebody to probably at least have a master's, if not a PhD, to be able to write the funding application. And then the model is often set up such that it's a scientific institution looking for a local partner to implement a project, which incentivizes the model where mostly the academic world would come up with an idea of what should be done in those local communities, and then look for a local partner to just implement the idea, rather than going to the local communities and asking, what do you really need? And what should we be developing for you? And so I think there needs to be a little bit of shift there in terms of approach. And also, if there is a way to come up with revenue-generating business models that can sustain organizations that do coral reef conservation and restoration, that would be a huge breakthrough. Though I know that's a challenge because corals do not make money.
Anders, what about you? What's your feeling on that? Should the role of international organizations, governments, and the private sector work more together?
Absolutely. I think it is very, very scattered in the landscape of who does what. Probably what we need is a CERN. We need a CERN for coral reef protection, because. But they are, of course, overarching umbrella organizations, also specialized for coral reef reconstruction and protection, and they do a great work. I do think that it's true that there is a disconnect to some degree. I just want to follow up on which relates to governments on the idea and the remark made that if you really want to protect nature, you got to leave it alone, clean, full stop. Okay. In fact, the best, as far as I know, the most biodiverse natural park we have in Europe today is around Chernobyl, because after the accident, nobody could go.
To go there. Yeah.
So all the photo traps show there's a fantastic diversity of life. Now the situation is different, but but of course this has to be weighed against the use of the land and the use of the sea. There is pulls and pushes here. But this is really a governmental decision, what you do. And the next problem, of course, is if you designate something as a protected area, how do you enforce it?
And at UNESCO, Fanny, I wanted to ask you, are there specific funding mechanisms to help local initiatives like these that we're hearing about?
Yeah, so UNESCO itself is not a financing organization, so especially when it comes to the field of coral reefs, it's either the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission that deals with the science, or when it's in my own field, it's through the World Heritage Convention, and that's really a work of bringing the science together for policy and decision making. So the financing component where it comes in is we do have a critical piece of work in helping governments to prioritize what really needs to be looked at and really what needs to be dealt with in a particular area. I think one of the interesting things that we have by going all the time to all these different coral reef ecosystems, what you create is sort of like a bird's eye view of what's actually happening in a particular area. And there's a number of coral reefs that are very underfinanced, and I'm then thinking especially in areas like Sudan. We have World Heritage listed coral reefs in Sudan, in Yemen, in other parts of the world that do not access the kind of financing that they should need. But there are other areas that have actually quite significant amount of financing. But a critical problem is that a lot of the different organizations that are receiving the financing or the donors that are providing the financing are not necessarily working together with the government to tackle the real critical priorities that are there. And so a part of UNESCO's work when we're working in those areas is really to bring the NGO community, the donor community, and the government, and often the local communities as well that are dependent on these resources, to bring all these different groups together and really try to sit down and say, okay, this might not be the most attractive thing to deal with and to attract the financing for, but this is really the most important thing to do now in order to protect that reef and give it a chance of survival. So that's where UNESCO really comes in, but then of course we also have partnerships. We have a partnership, for example, with the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, and these are these big financing mechanisms where we really help also a fund with that kind of resources to look at some of the priority areas that are fitting within their mandate, but from our perspective, areas that are not getting the kind of funding. A whole other, just to finish that, a whole other way that UNESCO as an organization really is at the cutting edge of financing is, for example, in Belize. There is really a big movement now, especially in countries, younger countries like Belize, but also, for example, in Ecuador and others, to go for what we call a debt for nature swap. So it's basically the national debt that gets restructured with the banking and financing sector, and a component of that restructuring is having financing being reserved there then for nature conservation. And so Belize, for example, was on the UNESCO World Heritage List in danger for a number of years. We worked with the government very closely together to come up with a clear plan, again, to set really clear priorities of what the reef needed in terms of being protected and scale up its resilience. That plan got adopted. We removed the Great Barrier Reef from the list of World Heritage and danger, and that basically having that priority setting, having a clear plan of what needs to happen, that basically formed the basis for a debt for nature swap, which now today is bringing tens of millions of dollars every single year into the conservation of the Great Barrier Reef, which is the second largest reef system in the world. So that's how UNESCO is really helping to move the needle when it comes to financing, while not necessarily being a financing institution as such.
Kristen, I would like to ask you about the financing challenges for your research. How are you managing that?
Sure. We've heard, I think, a really good point that so much of the funding goes to the ivory tower, PhD and master's level researchers, and even us in the ivory tower. We have our funders just decide they're done with corals and they quit. We spend so much time trying to, account for every penny so that we don't get in trouble. Honestly, the house is on fire, right? We don't really need to worry about every last penny in our checkbook right now because the house is on fire. So if you're thinking about funding coral reefs, add a zero. If you're thinking about making a bunch of stipulations, take them off. If you're thinking about being really stingy and picky about having the perfect project in exactly this region with exactly this number of stakeholders, delete all of that. What we need is huge amounts of money in the hands of people who know what they're doing and trust. We all know what we're doing, and we would be able to solve the coral reef crisis so much faster if you added a zero and you trusted us.
Emma, you're getting applauses here. I hope you can hear them. Emma, what about you?
Yeah, it's very similar to what we've heard, and I think Kristen just summarised that really well. I think, one of the challenges is, as we get different types of people interested in restoration, is also making sure, like for us as scientists, that we're accepting money from organisations and philanthropy and other that have the credibility and the right intent. And so that's also, we want money, exactly as Kristen said, to support the research and to do good. But also we have the challenge that we need to make sure that the money that we maybe have access to is ethical and that we can accept that. And so that often also limits down the funding that can be available, so it's not greenwashing, and that we don't lose the community engagement angle that we've worked really hard to build. My lab, for example, when we set out some of our research questions, like we spoke with the communities, like, what do you need? How can we implement them? What do we need together? But that level of trust then requires that's not broken, and that includes where we get our funding from. So absolutely, I think having more funding, but coordinated funding that both communities and academics can collaboratively access, I think is crucial.
Okay, thank you. We have about, I think, 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So If you could just introduce yourself and say who you want to ask your question to. There are some people over here. I see 2 hands over there. The mic is coming to you.
Hi, I'm Finlay from the Villars Institute. I just wanted to ask, how do you navigate the sort of double standards and contradictory commitments of governments to protect reefs while they continue to contribute to the factors of their destruction? And how do you ensure that it doesn't become greenwashing or futile, these sort of efforts for reef conservation? And I can maybe give you an example of a contradictory commitment. So a couple of years back, I was in far north Queensland, and I saw some, for example, urban development that was to do with the tourist industry. And I know it was mentioned with Curaçao, for example, the huge effect that it can have, urban development in these reef regions, where for example, the fertilizers run off into the water, or even the materials used in the construction can have huge detrimental effects on the reef. So how do you balance these factors and ensure that it doesn't become, as I said, greenwashing or futile? Thank you.
Do you want to address this question to a specific person or to the whole panel?
Just generally.
Okay,
yeah.
generally. So maybe Anders, you can start with.
Well, the answer is we don't address this. We don't interfere with the governments and their work. Of course, we interact with the governments. I get your point, obviously. We are working directly on the reef with the scientists there to implement monitoring strategies and measure the coral and provide the information that the government needs to implement the best possible protection strategy. After that, what they do, we have no influence on that, be completely clear. It would be nice if we did, but we don't. And of course, we have to tread very carefully there. This is not our job. We are guests.
Okay, I'd like to hear Kristen answer that question as well.
Sure. This is such an important point. Governments are funding coral reef research and conservation in the sort of 4 to 6 figure level. Sometimes there's some programs that are 7 or 8 figures, but the amount that they are exploiting and developing the coastline, taking bribes for real estate development, making deals to increase mass tourism, that happens at much, much bigger scales. And so a lot of times the amount that's being invested in nature is just a little tiny drop in the bucket. I had a bank invite me to help choose folks that would receive some of their conservation financing. And I said, well, I'd be happy to help you find some good projects, but it makes me uncomfortable how much you make money off of real estate and coastal construction at this point. And they never replied. They ghosted me because they were too uncomfortable with that disconnect. We're going to have to reconcile with that. And that's why I say, add a 0. And if that doesn't feel uncomfortable, then add another 0.
Emma, you wanted to add something?
Yes, thank you. I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think the one thing that we can do as scientists, particularly if we're involved in the restoration space, is being very clear what the restoration can and can't do, and not over-promising and overselling these solutions. We absolutely have to tackle climate change, and all of the restoration efforts are really important and really valuable and have a role to play, but we can't market them as saving the reef. And if we do that, I think we can add more harm than good to the intent. So I think us as individual scientists and us involved in restoration have a key role to play in ensuring that we effectively communicate the bounds of what we're actually doing.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? There's some hands over there.
Hello, my name is Lauriane Trimola from the Gallifrey Foundation. We are an ocean conservation organization based in Geneva. I have a question to anyone who'd like to answer to it. Do you actually talk to the fishing industry, whether artisan or industrial fishing, sorry? Because coral reefs can be super healthy, like in the Red Sea. I've been diving in the Red Sea several times. Corals are beautiful, but void of fish because it's overfished. 0, nada. So are you talking to these people, and what's the kind of exchanges that you have with them? Thank you.
Maybe Tamaki, you would like to answer?
Yes. So in our case, we do very much talk to the local fishermen or fishing community. And they obviously know their reefs and their ocean the best. So we recruit them to be coral gardeners. And obviously that has a ripple effect. So maybe addressing a point that Emma raised, we recognize that we cannot restore every reef around the world. It is a Band-Aid solution. We are just trying to buy time, and hopefully at some point global warming will stop or stabilize. And from there, we can still have a pocket of corals or coral reefs from where they can repopulate the oceans again. And so we see that by engaging the fishing community and doing coral reef restoration, we can have this maybe social ripple effect where we raise awareness and kind of open people's eyes as to what the value of a coral reef is and that they should be stewarding those reefs for future generations.
Fanny, at the institutional levels, is there dialogue between these industries?
Yeah, absolutely, and it goes further than just dialogue, and it operates at two levels. So, as I said, when we do the state of conservation of a particular coral reef that is inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage List, we'll go very intensively through who is fishing where, with what kind of gear, with what kind of measures for the output, and we really will work hard with the country in particular to see what can be done in order to make sure that when fishing happens, especially if it's local fishing for the food for the local community, how it can happen in a way that it is done sustainably. We have a very clear no-go commitment when it comes to World Heritage sites in general, and this we have a no-go commitment for any industrial extractive use, and so that does include fisheries. Now, of course, it isn't perfect. I would be the last person to say that, and we do have a number of, especially of our larger coral reef ecosystems that are being fished still, even industrially. And there's a very interesting article in the World Heritage Convention that says that the protection of World Heritage is not just the responsibility of the country where that World Heritage is located, but it's a shared responsibility of all countries around the world. So we do have certain countries and certain World Heritage sites where foreign vessels are doing industrial fishing still today in a particular World Heritage site. We are discussing very specifically with those that are doing that, even if they're foreign actors, because it is a shared responsibility, and we can do that under the World Heritage Convention's articles. So I think it's a very strong, it's not perfect in terms of the output, and it's not perfect because up to a couple of years ago, it was very hard to understand actually who was fishing under which flag in which area very specifically. And we do need that evidence when we go talk to a prime minister or a president. We do need to have very concrete evidence that something is happening in that area and it's such and so that is doing it and that has such and so effect. Now with the kind of tools that are out there like Global Fish Watch, for example, we do partner very regularly now with them to get a very clear understanding of what's actually happening and who is operating there and what are they fishing and what is the ways that we actually can convince the government to keep that out and at least keep it out of the World Heritage area. So it's becoming very intensive actually, and industrial fishing is a very big problem. It's not just industrial fishing, it's also the local fishing. I think we tend to oversee that these small fishing vessels are also having a huge effect because they're just so numerous in a lot of these places. So it works on these both levels that institutionally through UNESCO we're working with those partners.
Anders, you're nodding your head.
No, exactly. The industrial fishing is one thing, and we have seen some pretty horrible stuff. Trawling at 10 meters, which just destroys everything. But you're absolutely right. The artisanal fishery is so frequent, and so it's a death by 1,000 cuts. But they have to live, they have to survive, they have to fish. This is part of their culture, this is part of their identity. But the result is that they go on shallow water, drop a lead anchor over the boat, side of the boat, and poof, the coral is exploded. And when you've done that 10,000 times, well, you've done some real damage to the reef. So, but again, it's a difficult situation, right? Because we have real people there who have to live, who have to fish, who have to eat. And so, how do you balance this situation? At the same time, we have to be clear. I think it was completely right what was said. If we want to keep nature intact, we have to really stop interacting with it in a direct way. So it's a very delicate balance, and I think still the marine protected areas are the best option, and the UNESCO sites are the best option. But how do we enforce it in a reasonable way? It's a very tricky question.
Are there more questions here?
Hello, everyone. My name is Julio. I'm here with the Villar Institute. And Ms. Marhaver, online, you did introduce the financial aspect to coral reef. And so I wanted to ask, well, each panelist here, if I gave you $1 billion right now, what is the first thing you would do with it?
In terms of coral reef conservation, let's be clear.
Yeah, the answer is boats and guns.
Boats and guns.
Boats and guns. Big stretches of land, by land, establish marine protected areas, create the legal structures to never develop the land, and then get a bunch of boats and a bunch of guns and keep people away. It's really the best chance we have of saving the undeveloped pieces of land left in the world is to protect them with absolutely everything we can. And right now, the awesome science and technology and restoration methods that people are coming up with all around the world, we need time to get those scaled. We obviously need to invest in that. But the coral reefs we have left, like this one that's just, a couple dozen kilometers away from me, it just needs to be protected right now. No development, very little fishing, no hotels, no golf courses and airports. Just leave it alone. So maybe an unconventional answer from a dorky marine biologist.
Okay, Emma, you have $1 billion. How do you spend it?
So I definitely think buying land adjacent to reefs is crucial because, as we've heard earlier, with the Great Barrier Reef, water quality, particularly from runoff, is a stressor that can really antagonise areas. I think another thing that I would really want to do is to try and create the space, the network, the opportunity to ensure that the science, the communities globally have a space, whether or not it's, meetings or online, because we just don't have it at the moment to actually share the knowledge in a way that we can amplify learnings in a coordinated and systematic way. And that needs an overarching organisation to do that. We've heard that there are organisations together for conservation and protection of reefs, and there are, but there's still so many fragmented activities going on. And I think if we can harness coordinated knowledge sharing, then we can definitely amplify the impact that we can have for reefs.
Tamaki, what do you do with your $1 billion?
I don't know if $1 billion is enough. I'd say do everything to transition to renewable energy so we can stop the output of greenhouse gases today.
That's pretty good. Fanny?
I would do 4 things, but I do very much agree with you that, of course, the fossil fuel industry and the emissions are a critical component. But I would do 4 things. I would take $500 million, and I would invest it in a fund that gives, say, at least 10% return, so it stays in perpetuity. It isn't just a one-time grant. And the other $500 million, I would do 3 things. 1, I would put in place no-take zones and seasonal closures in the critical places that are essential for keeping the integrity of the ecosystem. I think that's one thing that is critical and that we really have to do and isn't being done the way it should be done. The second component is I really would invest in alternative livelihoods for the people that live and are dependent on these reefs. And I would very much concentrate on ecotourism. What we don't see, we do not protect. I have gotten multiple times people that have invested in really good work, and it was because they had been there. But we need to visit those places in an ecological way, and so I would invest in transforming some of the people that do extractive use and get them into a really eco way of visiting that. And the third thing I would do, I would educate the young people and the leaders of tomorrow of how to care for this in a very concrete way and in a very real way. Not the kind of things that are very, fascinating and interesting to finance, but really the critical issues and priorities that you need to do in order to keep a marine protected area or a World Heritage Site well. And I think those 4 things together, that would actually get us a very long way forward. And I'm happy to discuss with you if you have dollars.
Anders, what about you? Would you spend it all on the Transnational Red Sea Center and maybe try and get all the people working together around this troubled Red Sea today?
No, yes, that would be nice. But I have to say I haven't really thought about what I would do with $1 billion. I'm just trying to find $500,000. But I think this is a lot about capacity building, and I actually think that what was said before, that there is this disconnect between the ivory tower, which I personally sit in one, and what happens on the ground. And I think, we scientists, we are quite well funded. Let's be honest, in general, and we do good things. But the tech transfer, we need to get it out of our labs. We need to get it into the ground. I mean, on the ground, in the water. And this is something I know something about, the tech transfer, and I see that this requires real resources. It doesn't happen by itself. Okay? It happens through education, it happens through training, it happens through continuous interacting and building up of momentum. And this is something that I think really lifts the capacity of the local populations whose reefs we're talking about here to a higher level. And I think that is something where money should be flowing.
And that will be our conclusion today. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation and for this thought-provoking discussion. And after the deep sea space, the next session is the anticipatory briefing made in space, exploring the potential developments in exploiting space resources. And it will be in Auditorium C. Have a great afternoon and a great summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you.